Friday saw two bits of news relating to this struggle for power in presidential elections this year. The death of jailed Russian opposition figure Alexei Navalny was announced Friday afternoon by the prison service where he had been serving his sentence. And here in the U.S., the first of 4 criminal trials facing former President Donald Trump has been set to begin in March. Nevertheless, it's Venezuela that's in Washington's crosshairs, with the threat of reimposing some suspended sanctions and adding new ones after that nation's Supreme Justice Tribunal Court upheld a ban on opposition presidential candidate Maria Corina Machado, barring her from holding office and upending the U.S.-backed opposition's plans for the presidential election later this year. That decision came after 3 of Machado's allies were detained on accusations of conspiracy amid growing tension between the government of President Nicolas Maduro and the U.S.-backed political opposition. Washington had conditioned a continuation of some sanctions relief granted in October in an electoral deal that was signed in Barbados and included removing bans imposed on a number of opposition politicians, including Machado. For more on that, we first go to Esteli, Nicaragua, to speak with journalist Stephen Sefton, and we'll also be joined later from Havana, Cuba, by Camila Escalante. Stephen, let's talk about what's going on in Venezuela.
The whole business about Navalny is just another example of U.S. the complete cynical hypocrisy of the United States authorities. And look at what they're doing to Julian Assange, for example, where they've been persecuting him without any real cause for however long it is now. It's getting on for 15 years now, more than 15 years. And then you have the cases of Mumia Jamal and Leonard Peltier in the United States, who are only the most well-known, the most notorious cases of injustice of political prisoners in the United States. And now they're up in arms about somebody who was convicted under Russian law of engaging in activities to destabilize and perhaps overthrow the government of the Russian Federation. What would happen to somebody in the United States who is accused of that crime? And so, and they lock them up and throw away the key, And so, but we're well used to that kind of hypocrisy. That's nothing new on the part of the United States authorities. And in relation to the event in Venezuela, that's very similar to the events of 2021 in the Nicaraguan elections, when people who weren't even candidates were displayed by or were misrepresented by the United States authorities and media as legitimate electoral candidates when they never were. And so what does that case and this case now in Venezuela are an example of the way the United States completely disregards the constitutional arrangements, the legal arrangements, the electoral arrangements, the duly constituted behavior of the statutory electoral authorities in other countries, claiming that there are abuses of the electoral system. Well, in the case of this person, Corina Machado, and she's, as you said so rightly, Don, she's been a leading figure in the Venezuelan opposition, not necessarily the electoral opposition, but the kind of extra-parliamentary kind of golpista opposition that's committed to trying to overthrow, has been committed to trying to overthrow Venezuela's elected government ever since the era of much lamented Comandante Eterno Hugo Chavez. And now she's been continuing that activity with individuals like Henry Capriles and others, who is actually taking part, as I understand it, legitimately in the electoral process. But she herself has been disqualified by the electoral authority under the rules of of Venezuela's electoral system. And the United States refuses to recognize that. And this is just another example of the way the United States continues its destabilization recipe, which hardly varies from one year to the next or one decade to the next. It hardly changes. And in Venezuela now, they're trying to destabilize the elections scheduled for later this year, in fact, which are undergoing an extremely democratic process, whereby the government and the electoral authorities are engaging both with opposition parties and also with the church, which is opposed, the Catholic Church in particular, which is opposed to the government of the legitimate government of Nicolas Maduro. and all sectors of Venezuelan society to agree a program for scheduling the elections, which haven't been scheduled for a fixed date. So that's what they're trying to work out. And they're doing that in the most democratic way under their electoral rules, which are the same rules under which this Machado opposition leader has been disqualified. It's not that there aren't other opposition leaders that might take her place. There are plenty of opposition leaders. They're active in Venezuela, so it's far from being a case of the only opposition leader being excluded. And that's just another example, as I said, of U.S. destabilization in the region.
Camila, the things that she's done, in essence, they would be considered treason anywhere else. She's called for support for the sanctions, first of all, that are injuring the country, the people in the country. I don't understand how it's even an electoral strategy where you stand up and say, the people that are around me are starving, make them starve more. But that's the kind of activity she was involved in. Who would tolerate that?
Absolutely. No one would tolerate that. Certainly not in the West, and certainly not the United States, nor Canada, nor the UK, nor any of these major global North countries. If there was some sort of plot and authorities, the FBI, found some sort of information about an assassination attempt against the president of the United States, these people would be quickly rounded up, their homes would be raided, their computers and devices would be taken, all sorts of different things. And a lot of these opposition leaders, quote unquote, in Venezuela were closely tied to or vocally supporting the assassination attempts, the magnicide attempt, the incursion into Venezuela over the last few years to try to overthrow the government. Venezuela's government has repeatedly denounced the different coup plots that have taken place that not only targeted specifically, obviously, the president, sometimes his wife, but also the head of the armed forces, the defense minister himself, some of the highest authorities of both the Venezuelan state, but are also leaders of the Bolivarian Revolution today, the leaders of Chavismo. It's absolutely shocking what has been attempted or what has been carried out against Venezuela. And, they've tried so hard to do the same things in countries like Russia, places like Iran and Belarus, and even to some extent in China. And Machado, just like Navalny, are these dissenting voices, quote unquote, that these sorts of human rights organizations, such as the Human Rights Foundation, quote unquote, literally run by some opposition Venezuelan guy, and the Oslo Freedom Forum, they select these so-called anti-corruption champions and these pro-democracy activists, and they give them huge international platforms and bringing them together with other of these pro-Western, pro-NATO U.S. informants, activists of the right wing, which are probably many of them formerly on the State Department payroll. And they want to use, all these different events, such as the disqualification now of Machado and also now the death of Navalny, to try to mobilize people to destabilize these countries once again. And they're using it as these different events as ways to try to bring people out into the streets and create havoc. So we know what's going to happen next. Hopefully audiences and people in other countries aren't fooled by this, because we just see the same playbook over and over again in all parts of the world.
And it's interesting that there's a common thread, for example, in funding from the National Endowment for Democracy, both between Machado and Navalny. And pretty much they have a fingerprint on these little movements all around the world. I'd like to thank you guys for your time this week, and we'll speak with you again next week.
Thank you, Don.
Thank you, Don.
For KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.